Gateways do not announce themselves with slogans. They emerge when shipping lanes, energy systems, and investment routes begin to favor one entry point over another. Spain is increasingly being positioned as that entry point for Canada inside Europe. Not because Spain is the largest economy on the continent, but because it sits where infrastructure, ports, and continental access intersect. In late 2025, Canada and Spain signaled a new phase built around higher trade ambition and deeper cooperation in innovation and essential infrastructure. What looks like routine diplomacy is, in practice, the blueprint for a gateway relationship, one designed for endurance, scale, and long-horizon planning. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where power is measured through logistics, energy systems, and long-term alignment. In today's analysis, why Spain is becoming Canada's new European gateway, the focus is not on headlines, but on structure. What Spain offers that makes it a natural entry point into Europe. What Canada gains by leaning into that position, and why late 2025 signals suggest this corridor is being built deliberately. A gateway is not a metaphor. It is an infrastructure reality. It is the place where routes converge, where capacity exists before demand peaks, and where rules allow transactions to scale. Spain's gateway potential rests on three intersecting advantages: geography, infrastructure, and integration. Geography gives Spain dual access, Atlantic-facing links and Mediterranean-facing links, allowing it to serve multiple European routes without being locked into a single corridor. Infrastructure gives it ports, energy handling capacity, and logistics networks that can absorb growth without redesigning the entire system. Integration gives it access to Europe's single market, meaning that entry into Spain is not an endpoint, but a launch point into wider European distribution. For Canada, this matters because European access is not only about selling into one country, it is about plugging into a continent-wide system with fewer bottlenecks. When a relationship matures into gateway form, it reduces friction. It shortens planning cycles, lowers uncertainty, and makes investment defensible. Spain is increasingly being treated as a practical answer to a strategic problem: how to enter Europe with stability rather than improvisation. The late 2025 signal was not a single announcement, but a coordinated push that framed Canada-Spain cooperation as something meant to scale. In December 2025, Canada and Spain issued a joint statement that set an explicit ambition to work toward doubling two-way trade over the coming years. That language matters because it is not a narrow sector pledge, it is a trajectory commitment. Around the same period, Spain-Canada business engagement in Toronto emphasized cooperation in innovation, artificial intelligence, and essential infrastructure, with Spain's economy minister chairing the summit. This combination, trade scale plus infrastructure and technology focus, signals a shift from transactional exchange to corridor building. A gateway relationship requires not only buyers and sellers, but planners, financiers, and institutional pathways. Late 2025 framed the relationship in exactly those terms. It suggested that the corridor is expected to carry more than goods. It is expected to carry projects, investment decisions, and long-horizon coordination, precisely what turns a bilateral relationship into a gateway. Gateway power is built where physical flow becomes predictable. Spain's position inside European logistics is valuable because it can absorb and redistribute. Ports are not simply docking points. They are scheduling systems, customs systems, storage systems, and onward transport systems. When those layers function together, a country becomes a platform rather than a destination. For Canada, the strategic advantage is straightforward: an entry point that can route into multiple European demand centers without relying on a single choke point. This reduces exposure to congestion, disruption, and policy friction elsewhere. It also supports diversification inside Europe itself, because routing through Spain can connect to different continental arteries depending on where demand emerges. The gateway story, therefore, is not about replacing other partners. It is about adding a structural option that improves resilience. Logistics is often treated as background. In reality, it is leverage. The partner that sits at the entry point influences timelines, costs, and reliability. Spain's infrastructure depth and geographic placement allow it to play that role. Canada's interest is not symbolic alignment, it is operational advantage. Energy is where gateway relationships become strategic rather than commercial. When energy systems are strained, what matters most is not theoretical supply, but the ability to receive, process, store, and distribute reliably. Spain's role in Europe's energy architecture makes it a relevant corridor partner for countries that plan in decades rather than quarters. For Canada, the value is not simply access to European demand, but access through an entry point that is built around handling large-scale flows and adapting to changing constraints. This matters because energy security is now treated as system design. Infrastructure has to work under stress. Planning has to anticipate volatility. Partnerships have to be reliable enough to integrate into long-horizon assumptions. Late 2025 Canada-Spain signaling emphasized essential infrastructure and long-term cooperation, which is the language of system resilience rather than spot transactions. Gateway relationships that include energy coordination tend to deepen over time because the investments are capital-intensive and difficult to unwind. Once planning cycles align, reversibility declines. That is how gateways become durable. They move from optional routes to embedded routes. Most strategic corridors do not begin with shipments. They begin with rules that make sensitive cooperation possible. In September 2025, Canada and Spain signed a General Security of Information Agreement designed to protect classified information and enable deeper cooperation in sensitive sectors. This is not a public-facing consumer story, but it is a structural one. Agreements like this tend to unlock participation in higher-value projects where security requirements, procurement standards, and trusted information handling are prerequisites. In practical terms, it supports cooperation that is adjacent to critical infrastructure, advanced technology, and high-complexity industrial work. Gateway relationships are strengthened when the institutional layer supports trust at the technical level, not only at the diplomatic level. This is how cooperation graduates from trade into systems. It allows companies to operate across more demanding sectors and reduces the friction that often blocks deeper industrial integration. When the enabling framework is in place, investment becomes easier to justify because it carries fewer legal and security uncertainties. This is the quiet architecture behind visible corridors, and it is one reason Spain is increasingly relevant to Canada's European planning. The next phase of gateway power is increasingly digital. Physical goods move through ports. High-value services move through contracts, standards, and talent ecosystems. Late 2025 engagement between Canada and Spain placed explicit emphasis on cooperation in innovation, artificial intelligence, and essential infrastructure. That emphasis matters because it builds a corridor that is less vulnerable to physical disruption. Digital and professional services scale without the same exposure to congestion, strikes, or transport bottlenecks. They also integrate deeper into industrial systems because they often sit upstream: design, engineering, optimization, and systems management. For Canada, this opens a pathway into European value chains that does not depend solely on commodity cycles. For Spain, it strengthens an innovation-linked role inside Europe by connecting external capability to domestic and regional projects. When digital cooperation grows alongside physical logistics, the relationship becomes layered. Layered relationships endure because they can absorb shocks in one layer without collapsing the entire corridor. This is a core feature of gateway strategy: redundancy, flexibility, and compounding ties across multiple domains. Gateway relationships produce benefits slowly, then all at once. For industry, the first advantage is predictability. Clearer routing assumptions, fewer contingencies, and more defensible planning. For infrastructure developers, the advantage is sequencing. Projects can be financed and built with long-horizon demand signals rather than speculative optimism. For investors, the advantage is reduced uncertainty. Lower risk premiums when corridors are backed by institutional alignment and repeated engagement. For regional economies, the advantage is steadier activity. Logistics and infrastructure are not seasonal, they are structural. Canada benefits by gaining a European entry logic that is not reliant on one pathway, improving resilience inside a continent that is increasingly constraint-driven. Spain benefits by deepening its role as a platform, an economy that is not merely participating in European trade, but shaping how external flows enter and distribute across it. Over time, these benefits compound. The corridor becomes easier to use, more attractive to expand, and harder to replace. That is when a gateway stops being a theory and starts behaving like infrastructure. Spain becoming Canada's European gateway is not about a single sector, and it is not about visibility. It is about the deliberate construction of an entry point relationship that can scale under constraint. The late 2025 signal, an explicit ambition to double two-way trade, sets a magnitude frame. The business and policy emphasis on innovation, AI, and essential infrastructure sets the system's frame. And the enabling agreements layer adds the trust frame that supports higher value cooperation over time. When these elements converge, a partnership stops being transactional and begins to behave like a corridor. Over the next decade, the most influential relationships will be those that integrate logistics, energy handling, institutional trust, and digital capability into a single pathway. Spain has the infrastructure logic to serve as an entry point. Canada has the stability and capacity to treat that entry point as a long-horizon asset. That is why this gateway narrative is emerging now, and why it is likely to deepen quietly rather than dramatically. Spain's gateway value is not a slogan. It is the compound result of geography, infrastructure, institutional alignment, and corridor building intent. Late 2025 signals, an ambition to double trade and a focus on innovation and essential infrastructure, suggest that Canada and Spain are designing a relationship meant to scale. When a partnership evolves into a gateway, it reduces friction, lowers uncertainty, and becomes harder to substitute. That is how durable access is built. In a constrained world, stability is not guaranteed by size. It is engineered through reliable entry points and resilient systems. Spain is increasingly positioned to provide that entry logic within Europe, and Canada is increasingly positioned to treat it as a long-horizon strategic asset. And there you have it. If you found this breakdown valuable, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these global shifts without compromise. This was why Spain is becoming Canada's new European gateway. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.